Good Shabbos. This week is Parshas Emor, and one of the subjects addressed in this parsha is the mitzvah of Svira, Sviras HaOmer. We count the days between Pesach and Shavuos. On Pesach, the second day, we brought a mincha, a meal offering, which is called the Omer, and then we count 49 days, and on the 50th day, we bring another offering, which is brought on the day of Shavuos, on the 50th day. And during that time between Pesach and Shavuos, we're supposed to count those days. And simply, you would understand that the reason you count it is that we're now happy that we're moving towards a time when there's Shavuos, when we bring another offering. And traditionally, we understand that the day of Shavuos is the time when the Torah was received by the Jews on Mount Sinai. So we're going from the time when the Jews were taken out of Egypt and formed as a nation till they received the Torah, and that's a joyous time. But yet, we know that historically it became a time of mourning. And the Gemara actually says, the Medrash says, that the reason it becomes a time of mourning, it says that Bizman she Yisrael osin ritzono shel makom, when the Jews follow the will of God, it's a happy time. But when Jews don't follow the will of God, it's not such a happy time. In other words, any time where you are expecting to be reaching towards perfection, if you fail, it becomes a time of sin and therefore a time of punishment. And the Talmud tells us that in those 49 days, during that time, the students of Rebbe Kiva, which numbered 24,000, all died. And they died of Misa Meshuna. It says a very terrible death. And just as an aside, we take a break from the time of mourning on Lag BaOmer, which is this coming week, because on that day they stopped dying. And the question is whether they stopped dying on that day and they continued or it stopped completely. It doesn't really matter for our discussion. It's still something's going on here that we have transformed a time of joy to a time of sadness. So the Gemara tells us, why did they die? Because they didn't show honor, respect one to another. And again, at first glance, this sounds unbelievable. Here we have 24,000 students of Rebbe Kiva. I would assume, or we should assume, that these students were following Rebbe Kiva's teaching and therefore hopefully modeling after him. And they didn't show respect. How much could they not show respect that they all deserve to die, and not only die, but die a terrible death? So one possible explanation is that maybe what we're supposed to learn from here is a lesson rather than an explanation of God sort of giving a terrible death to people who just didn't show a little respect. And even from a historical point of view, historians suggest that these students of Rebbe Kiva were really followers of Rebbe Kiva, and this was the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and they died at the hands of the Romans. But the Talmud always wants us to learn a lesson for us, for all times, rather than just knowing a little bit of history. And the way that's done is to teach us, you know what? They didn't show respect. And what does that mean, they didn't show respect? So, again, when you have 24,000 students, it's very possible that it became a mass movement. That you had a great leader, Rebbe Kiva, one of the greatest teachers, one of the greatest leaders, one of the greatest rabbis of all time. Everybody would have just been drawn to him. But when you have a mass movement, a lot of times what you have is a lot of conformity. Everyone tries to be exactly like Rebbe Kiva, and they all end up being sort of just carbon copies of each other. And they don't really respect the individuality of every person. I like to always go back to the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says, Shali shalach v'shalach shali, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine, is an Amma Aretz, is an ignorant person. Why? On the surface, it sounds great. Everyone's sharing, we love each other, we care for each other, we share. It's sort of the communist ideal. But what's perhaps failing is the inability to recognize individuality. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine is not only that I give you and I share the material possessions that I have, but what's mine, my ideas are mine, but they're really yours, and what your ideas are mine. We don't separate the two. We're all the same. So it sounds nice that we should treat each other equally and live peacefully, but we're not growing as individuals and we're not gaining from any other ideas. We're all just modeling, whether it's Rabbi Akiva or some other ideal, and we're all being the same. We're not coming up with our own individual perspective, new ideas, fresh start, looking at things differently, and therefore coming at it from a different angle and growing appropriately. And therefore, there's no real future. So again, let's put aside the fact that they died a terrible death, but there's no future for people who are not coming up with individual ideas, that are all just trying to copy each other. They're the people in the Mishnah that are really amoratzim. They're ignorant people. They might have been students, they might have been very knowledgeable, but they're ignorant about understanding human beings, understanding what drives people to grow and to become a greater people, a greater nation, and a greater individual. You can't if you're only just modeling somebody else. And this is a problem that we have in any movement, and specifically also in religious movements. I've noticed certain great rabbis who are really changing the way people think, and then his students seem to be nothing special. They haven't really grown. Why? Because they're all saying, I want to be like that rabbi. I want to be like Rabbi Akiva. But what happens with Rabbi Akiva? After these 24,000 students die, it says then he took 5 students, very famous students, and he says they were the ones who reestablished Torah within the Jewish people. Why? Because when you have 5 students and they're really the ideal student is not to be a copy of the teacher, but rather to teach you how to think. The teacher is supposed to teach you how to think, and therefore what you are, which is different than Rabbi Akiva, different than the rabbi, different than your teacher, you blossom into your own individual, and you have a new path. And there's diverse paths, and the more diversity we have, the more ideas we have, the more balanced our society is, the more balanced ideas are. Otherwise, you end up just sort of being sort of stagnant and even corrupt, because you're only there to support what was always said, what was always done. There always has to be a balance between the two. We want to keep tradition. We don't want necessarily a lot of change. So there's a difficult balance that has to be made. We want to remember Rabbi Akiva, we want to remember his teaching, we want to remember his ways, but there's always a different angle. And if you look at even in the world of rabbinic leadership or in Hasidic rabbis, the great rabbis are the ones which have a different and new perspective. Does that mean they didn't respect their elders? They didn't respect their father or their teacher? No. It means that the teacher was able to instill within them an approach to learning which says, what do you see? How do you see this? How do you come to it? Use your own, where you're coming from, and making sure that you understand it from your own perspective. And it's similar to sort of like if you think about it as a rainbow, right? The rainbow, what does it do? It takes pure white light and you put it through a prism and it changes into 7 colors. Because what makes something white, which is that pure white light of understanding, perspective, God, Torah, however you want to describe it, it really consists of many different ingredients. There's the red, there's the green, there's the different colors of the rainbow, and together they're able to make white light. When you have these 5 students and they go out and they each teach a different approach, but all somehow with respect for their teacher, but not necessarily just mimicking them, then you have a Jewish people once again. You have a mode of survival of the Torah and the Jewish people. Good Shabbos.